The speaker today is Lee Denniston, who became interested in the whole question of what happened to people after the war. You learn about all these folks and then they sort of vanish from history with a couple of notable exceptions. I think everybody pretty much knows what happened to Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Hoover and a couple of people like that. But what about some of the lesser known actors, people that were very well known during the war, or maybe people that were just did things of marked heroism during the war? What happened to them? How did they deal with the aftermath of the war? And as the initial slide shows, what did they tell their kids? So our speaker is Lee Denniston, who is well known to all of us. And Lee has been making a study of these sorts of things. And I can assure you that he has a huge amount of material. And if we like this one, there will be more. Lee, it's yours.
Okay, fair warning to everybody, there's a lot of slides, but most of them are photographs. They don't require any great reading effort. And they just illustrate a phase in people's lives. And of course, the real question is, okay, there we go. What did you do after the war, Daddy? And of course, to start with, I'm going to do a couple of people that doesn't apply to because they didn't have an after the war. Our dear friend Gavrilo Princip, the trigger man of Sarajevo. Of course, he's taken in the act. He tries to shoot himself, doesn't manage. The Austrians give him and his fellow conspirators, they got most of them, a pretty fair trial. That's Gavrilo there in the middle. According to Austrian law, because of his age, he couldn't be condemned to death. So he was given the maximum possible sentence of 20 years in prison. He was imprisoned in the Theresienstadt fortress. It's now Terezin in the Czech Republic. It had been used as a prison for political prisoners for a long time. It all looks nice and gardening now. It was, by the way, used as a concentration camp by the Germans in World War II, so it couldn't have been a very nice place. But when you look at the interior, these are all solitary confinement cells. And about the only light that gets into them is through those little doors, windows in the doors, and a small window in the walls. He is kept in solitary confinement, essentially, not even allowed out at the time the other prisoners are allowed to exercise. He is chained to the wall in his cell at times, not particularly well fed, and he's tubercular. And that gets worse and worse. He attempts suicide in 1916, fails, loses an arm in 1917 to tuberculosis of the bone. He's interviewed by an Austrian psychiatrist a couple of times, refuses to accept any responsibility for the war, says it would have come anyway. He does regret having shot Sophie. His second bullet was intended for Oskar Patyoric, the Austro-Hungarian governor of Bosnia, and he missed. And he dies in April of 1918. Now, his body is initially buried in an unmarked grave so that it won't become a shrine for anti-Austro-Hungarian parties. But in 1920, a Czech soldier who had been part of the burial party leads representatives of the Yugoslav government to the grave. They exhume him, take him back, and put him in a memorial chapel outside of Sarajevo, where he remains. He's still very much of a controversial character in the Balkans. If you're a Serbian, he's a great hero. If you're a Bosniak, maybe not so much. The house he lived in Sarajevo has been torn down and rebuilt several times. And the memorials at the site of the assassination have been changed, torn down, disposed of, and replaced a number of times. Now, other than him, the other guy who didn't make it is the guy who sent him on his way. Dragutin Dmitrievich, he's a lieutenant colonel in the Serbian army at the time of the war starts, the head of Serbian military intelligence, and he goes under the nom de guerre of Apis, after the Egyptian bull god, in the Black Hand organization. That's the Black Hand seal to his side. The motto on top says Ujedinjenje ili smrt, unification or death. And this great skull and crossbones flag, along with a bomb, a knife, and a bottle of poison. This is not a nice man. Now, in 1903, a group of Serbian officers decided that the king and queen, who were from the Abaronovich family, were insufficiently anti-Austrian. They break into the palace. They kill a number of people. They basically shoot the king and queen a number of times, mutilate their bodies, and throw them out a second-story window. Dmitrievich is one of those who is a leader of the group. And he stays pretty much the same violent anti-Austrian throughout. Now, World War I, that's him on the right. He proves to be an effective staff officer and strategic planner, stays with the Serbian army as they retreat through Montenegro to the coast and then out into the Mediterranean, and then on to Salonika in Greece. However, by this point, Nikola Pasic, the Serbian prime minister, has decided he needs to get rid of Black Hand. They're just too much of a threat. There's an attempt made on the life of the Crown Prince of Serbia in 1916, and that becomes a convenient excuse to arrest all of the members of the Black Hand, starting with Dmitrievich. And he's tried at Salonika, convicted of treason, and taken out and shot. And on the way to the execution, he is reported to have told the officer in charge of the guard that I'm being shot for that business in Sarajevo. Now, in 1953, the Yugoslav Supreme Court reopens the case and decides that he wasn't guilty, which doesn't do him any good whatsoever. Now, I put these two together in harness at the start because at the start of the war, they are in harness in Washington as respectively the military and naval attaches of Germany. Now, they're both called Captain von Papen and Captain Boyed. The difference being that von Papen is an Army captain, an 03, Boyed is an 06 Navy captain. Probably reflecting the German concern with the relative power of the American Army and Navy at that time. They're both up to their eyebrows in espionage, sabotage, and propaganda, all financing all sorts of things, directing all sorts of things. Their antics finally get them thrown out of the country at the end of 1915. They go home on different ships. This is von Papen waiting to get on the ship to take him home. I haven't figured out where the crowd behind him is there to cheer him on or to make fun of him. He is given American diplomatic safe conduct to get home, but the British Navy boards his ship and informs him that you're protected, your baggage isn't. And they proceed to rifle through all of his baggage, collect all the papers in there. They find things like all of the check stubs for the sabotage deals that he was doing. They gleefully hand it to the United States. Middle of 1916, von Papen is indicted for his actions by a federal grand jury. Now, when he gets back to Germany, he's back in the Army. He initially thinks he's going to be given advice to all the bigwigs. He's actually sent to command a battalion on the Western Front, which he does for quite some time. And he's promoted and sent to Turkey to be the chief of operations for first Falkenhayn and then Lehman von Sanders commanding Turkish forces in Palestine. Turkey signs an early armistice. German forces in Turkey are interned. Von Papen doesn't like orders coming out from the new government as the times change. Protests, stows away on a hospital ship, gets to Italy, and from there makes his way back to Germany. Manages to get in to see Hindenburg, protests violently about these horrible left-wingers doing things to the army. He had made himself liable to court-martial, but I think Hindenburg basically said, I got enough troubles, I don't need this. Why don't you just go away, von Papen, which he does. Now, von Papen has money, quite a bit of money, actually. His family was well-to-do, and he married the heiress to the Villeroy and Bosch porcelain company fortune. He buys a farm and tries to set himself up as a gentleman farmer. He gets involved with the Freikorps movement because he says he's trying to protect his farm and others from communists. He is a devout Catholic and despises the godless communists. Later on, he joins something called the Herren Club, which is exactly what it sounds like. It means the aristocrats club. He gets involved with a lot of very conservative politicians. The man over here with him is Kurt von Schleicher. He's a Reichswehr general, a schemer from the word go. His name apparently means something like sneaker, translated into English. And von Papen uses some of his money to buy a controlling interest in the Germania newspaper, which is the leading Catholic newspaper in Germany. And he gets encouraged to run for the Prussian parliament, not the Reichstag, not the Reich parliament, but the Prussian parliament. His sponsor is one Baron Engelbert von Kerkerenk-Zerborg. That name strikes me as something that belongs either on Sesame Street or Star Trek. I'm not sure which. He's elected, not particularly active, but he makes a continuous attempt to push policies further and further to the right. He's made it apparent right from the beginning that he believes that Germany needs not a party-based government, but an authoritarian government. He meets a number of important people like Oscar Hindenburg, the field marshal's son, and a number of other prominent right-wing politicians. 1932, several years on, he has made a name for himself in conservative politics, but not much of a reputation in Germany as a whole. But he has met Hindenburg again and again. He's known to him. Hindenburg thinks well of him. The last real chancellor of the Weimar government, a man named Brüning, is forced to resign. The question is, who's going to take place? Well, von Schleicher, who is advising Hindenburg, and others recommend von Papen. So Hindenburg reaches down basically deep into the politics of Germany and grabs this fairly obscure figure and makes him the chancellor. And at the same time, he dissolves the Reichstag. Now, what that does is give von Papen as chancellor the ability to more or less rule by decree for a while until there's a new election. He brings in what gets popularly called the Cabinet of Barons. That's him sitting there looking a little apprehensively, I think, at the camera. The members of his cabinet, the different ministers, they're all extremely wealthy, extremely conservative, mostly titled men. He makes a number of attempts to put new policies in place. He does one positive thing for Germany. he manages to get the Allies to back off reparations payments. Von Schleicher, by the way, is his Minister of War. But he's never able to get, when they have new elections for the Reichstag, any kind of real support. And the Nazis are the largest single party in the Reichstag at this point. Von Papen had met Hitler in 1932, didn't think much of him except as a rabble-rouser. But he's there. You can't do anything without him. And Hitler won't accept any lesser position than Chancellor. End of 1932, end of November, von Papen has to resign. He just can't hold things together any longer. He doesn't have support in the Reichstag. Von Schleicher comes in as the Chancellor for a very short period of time, 2 months. And then again, he can't put together enough of a majority in the Reichstag to form a government. The only person that's left, of course, is Adolf himself. Now, at this point, von Papen, who is a political schemer, I read one account of him that says he was a man unencumbered by a moral compass, goes to Hindenburg along with a couple of others and suggests making Hitler the chancellor with von Papen as the vice chancellor. And von Papen thinks that he can then control Hitler. There's no prizes for guessing how that worked out. Adolf Hitler is not a man who lets anybody take over. There are only 3 of the 8 ministers are Nazis, but they're key ministers, to include the one, Hermann Goering, that gives him control of the police. And as soon as he is in position as a chancellor, he turns the SA, the brown shirts, loose, he turns the police loose, and all of a sudden political violence goes up sharply. Von Papen very quickly figures out that he can't control Hitler, and he gets marginalized rather quickly. Goes on until the middle of 1934. Hitler has sensed that there are some opposition figures in the Nazi Party, mostly in the SA, but also some others. And what becomes known as the Night of the Long Knives at the end of June 1934, several hundred members of the SA leadership are simply summarily executed by the SS. They break into von Papen's office in the vice chancellery. They kill one of his assistants, take another one prisoner. He disappears and his body shows up in the river later. Von Papen himself is kept in house arrest for several days, not sure if he's going to be shot or not. Von Schleicher and his wife are both killed. Finally, von Papen is let loose. He goes back to Hitler and resigns, but he also sends Hitler a letter that says this, among other things. That's about as brown-nosing a statement under the circumstances as I can imagine. Later on, he claims he only did it because he was so upset by what was going on and he was trying to protect his other friends. But it comes across as, please don't shoot me. Now he goes back to his house after actually resigning and stays out of politics for a while. But then there's a crisis in Austria. And there are problems related to the assassination of the Austrian chancellor. Mussolini at this point is still not sure about Hitler and starts sending Italian troops up to the border with Austria. Von Papen gets a call that he says pleaded with him to go become the ambassador in Austria. Everybody always pleads for his help if you read his memoirs. Goes to Austria, and his real job is to pave the way for Austria to become an integral part of the German Reich, which he does lots of conniving, lots of scheming. And eventually, of course, there is the Anschluss. Now, jumped one. In between Austria and the end of the war, once Austria becomes a part of Germany, he's sent down to Turkey. Had experience in Turkey during World War I. He becomes the ambassador to Turkey with the job of holding a lid on things and keeping Turkey out of the war, which he mostly does, but he's also scheming. He claims he was in direct communication with Franklin Roosevelt, looking for a way to end the war. You know, he's always a man of peace and so forth. He's always a man looking for a way to keep himself out of trouble. November 1944, Turkey breaks off diplomatic relations with Germany. It's already obvious who's going to win. So he goes home, and he stays home until the American forces arrest him. He's very indignant about being arrested. How dare you do this to me? He is tried at Nuremberg, and he's one of 3 of the defendants of Nuremberg who is acquitted, mostly on technical grounds because he was not found to have participated in any of the planning for the crimes against humanity, which were the limits of the Nuremberg trial jurisdiction. But as soon as he gets out, he goes before a German denazification court. He's found to have been guilty of helping bring the Nazis to power. He's sentenced to 8 years in prison. He spends 2 years in prison, and by then the fad for denazification in Germany is over with, and the rest of his sentence is commuted. He gets out, and he literally spends the rest of his life, and it's a fairly long one, writing things that justify what he did. His memoirs come out in 1953, and it is the most self-serving thing I've ever read. And he also strongly criticizes the Bonn government, the Bundesrepublik government, on very, very strict Catholic grounds. Dies in 1969. And I thought for a long time that was going to be the end of it. Then about a week ago, sorting through stuff, I discovered a December 2019 German news report that some left-wing activists had gone in, broken up his grave, and stolen his gravestone in a protest against neo-Nazis in Germany. So he still has an influence a long time on. Now, his partner in crime in the U.S., Karl Boyed, is considered a much more personable person than von Papen. Von Papen was described as cold, arrogant, and Prussian. And Prussian is not a good word in that use. Boyed, much more personable. Von Papen never showed any signs of stress from his time in the U.S. Boyed suffers from insomnia, phagomania, the need to eat all the time, and he said his nerves suffered a crack from his time in America. Now, comes back, he joins the naval intelligence staff of the German Navy for the war, and then at the end of the war, very quietly retires and goes to work for an organization called the North German Hansa, which is a trade and shipping organization in Hamburg. And he kind of disappears from things until June of 1921, when all of a sudden the society pages in American newspapers go nuts with the word that Virginia Mackay Smith, the daughter of the late Episcopal Bishop of Pennsylvania, has gone to Germany and married Karl Boyed. Apparently, the rather dashing Boyed had met Miss Mackay Smith while he was in Washington. They had come to what the era called an understanding, but the German government never gave him permission to marry before he had to go home. Now, how he kept in touch with her during the war is quite unclear. There were ways to get communications through, but obviously they got back together again after the war. They married, they had a daughter in 1922. In 1926, he tries to get a visa to come back to the United States and discovers that the American government has no romance in its soul at all. He's turned down. American newspapers are very indignant over the idea of this man coming back. So they live on an estate outside Hamburg. In 1930, Boyet dies as a result of a horse riding accident, falls and breaks his neck. At some point after that, Mrs. Boyet comes back to the United States. It's unclear exactly when, with her daughter. Now, I found, oddly, a 1942 news report in a Pittsburgh newspaper, roundly scolding the American-born wife of a different German diplomat for World War II, who had gone back with her husband to Germany after the start of the war, and then saying nice things about Mrs. Boyet because she was obviously back in the United States. But they hadn't done their paperwork and their homework, because the last line of the article is, "Where is Captain Boyet?" Now, she lived on very quietly, apparently, for the rest of her life. But her gravestone has her maiden name over the heading, wife of Captain Carl Boyet. I've only got one picture of this guy. That's because every other picture I can find was essentially the same. A Russian general in a vastly over-decorated uniform. Vladimir Sukhomlinov. He was the Russian war minister at the start of World War I. He'd been the chief of staff. Militarily conservative. He said at one point that he hadn't read a military book in 20 years. You know, why is everybody worried about firepower? War hasn't changed that much. He was reputed to have been not above lining his own pockets, and we know he helped out some of his friends financially from government funds. But in 1915, the inadequacies of everything he was doing, all the disasters that had befallen the Russian army and the failures of supply, he was removed from office. And in 1916, he and a number of other officers were tried for treason by the imperial government. It was scapegoating, really. He was convicted and originally sentenced to what in Russian is called katorga. That is the traditional sentence of being sent to Siberia. But they decided that that was a little old-fashioned, so it was converted to just imprisonment. He's thrown into a cell in the Peter and Paul Fortress in Petrograd. His wife is well-connected, manages to get the Empress to allow Vladimir out into house arrest. The imperial family falls. The new provisional government throws him back in jail. Then the provisional government falls, and in the confusion around the Bolshevik takeover, he gets out and manages to make his way, we think alone, because his wife is never mentioned again, to Germany. This is 1918, 1919 period. He lives in poverty in Germany, writing articles defending himself. He writes a memoir of the war. It's completely out of print. I wasn't able to find anything. The only copy I ever found for sale was up for $250, which is a little rich for my blood. And he has one of the most pathetic ends. He is found frozen to death on a park bench in Berlin in February of 1926. There is, on the other hand, a different Russian, Alexei Alexeyevich Brusilov, generally credited being the best Russian general of the war, the Brusilov offensive, and so forth and so on. He is a thoroughgoing imperialist, but at the same time, he recognizes the need for change. When the Tsar falls, he throws in his lot with the imperial government, with the provisional government. And Kerensky, there haranguing a crowd on this stand, appoints him, Brusilov, the new commander-in-chief of the Russian army. Now, Brusilov believes the only way they can reestablish the army is to get pretty draconian measures of discipline, but that doesn't happen, and the army's disintegrating anyway. Kerensky directs one major offensive, which falls apart, and at the end of it, Brusilov is fired, and he just goes back to Moscow, to an apartment where his wife has been living. Now, there's lots of disturbances going on. The army is in rebellious form. Brusilov is actually wounded by some stray shell fragments during the rebellion in Berlin. It takes him a while to recover. And he just stays quiet for a while. But in 1920, Russia, now under Bolshevik control, is at war with Poland. Poland is trying to extend their borders further to the east by taking Russian land. And Brusilov decides that his job is to support Russia. He puts out a plea for former Tsarist officers to join the Red Army. Many of them do. He himself helps design the new Red Army and train it. He becomes the inspector of cavalry for a time before he finally retires in 1924 and dies in 1926. Now, Soviet military historians ignored most Tsarist generals for a long period of time, into the 1980s. And they finally began to look at it. After the fall of the communist system in 1990, a lot of writing comes out. I found one book that's called Luchaya Polkovodya z Pierwoj Mirovoj. It means the best commander of the First World War. They wanted $95 for it, and it would have taken 6 months to get, so I didn't. He also gets a little credit, which most don't. And this statue goes up in St. Petersburg in 2007. It's about the only Tsarist general that has one. Now we're going a different direction entirely. I had two American flyers that I could have talked about. One of them was obvious, Eddie Rickenbacker. The other one is this gentleman, Marion C. Cooper. During the war, he's a DH-4 pilot. Now, Cooper is shot down, and he survives the crash, spends the last couple of months of war in a German POW hospital, returns to France, and stays in the service. And then he's assigned to the food relief program, and eventually gets sent to Poland to head it up over there, which is kind of fortuitous because he believes that his family has a link to Poland. His great-great-grandfather had fought with Kazimierz Pulaski, the Polish volunteer with the American Revolution at Savannah. Now, Pulaski is wounded and dies there, but Cooper feels a sense of debt to the Polish people. They're fighting Russia at this point, the other half of that battle. So he goes back, recruits a bunch of American flyers, and comes back and joins the Polish Air Force in the Kosciuszko Squadron, named after the other Polish volunteer in the Revolution. They're flying mostly German confiscated airplanes, and interestingly, almost all of their flying is ground attack I found only one reference to any air-to-air combat at all. But again, he gets shot down. Captured by the Bolsheviks. He's put into a Bolshevik labor camp outside of Moscow. Now he and a couple of Polish officers managed to escape. They make their way cross country somehow or another, about 700 miles to Latvia, which is independent at that point, and he gets back to the United States. Now the Poles remember him. It's a Polish-made resin figurine of Cooper. I tried to find them. They're not for sale anymore. The Poles also made a full-length movie about what he did in Poland. At the end of World War II, the Russians rounded up every copy of the movie they could find and destroyed it because he was leading a fight against them. Now, when he gets back, he becomes a journalist and a travel writer. Travels all over the place, all sorts of friendly little friends. It becomes very well known. He joins the New York Explorers Club, which is quite exclusive. And he gets involved with Hollywood because of his movies being made about his travels. Becomes a director and producer. You may have heard of one of the movies that he produces and directs. And he also does a cameo in the movie because he flies the airplane that shoots King Kong off of the building. Now he does a long, long string of movies throughout the 30s, very prolific, directs and produces. But comes World War II, he goes back into the Army Air Force at that time as a colonel. He works logistics for the Doolittle raid for a while, then becomes chief of staff of the China Air Task Force under Claire Chennault, and then becomes chief of staff of the Bomber Command for the Southwest Pacific. Ends the war as a brigadier general. Goes back to Hollywood. Looks like the picture for the back cover of a book. But he also does, again, a lot of producing at this point, less directing. And you may have heard of some of his movies. Fort Apache, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, Rio Grande, and The Quiet Man. Did a lot with John Ford and the Duke. At the time of his death in '69, he was working on Cinerama. This guy just never ran out of energy at all. Quite a character all the way along. Now, somebody else that gets involved with Hollywood, well, picture taken from a photograph of the 135th Aero Squadron. At the end of the Samiel offensive, this man, name is Lee Duncan, was sent out to try and find a new field for his squadron to fly from. He's looking around and he discovers an abandoned German Shepherd mother with some pups. He saves the dogs. They come back and they become mascots for the squadron. When it comes time to go home to the United States, he manages to get the dogs on the boat with him. And you may have heard of the dog. It's Rin Tin Tin. Name comes from name of a French doll that a lot of kids had. Now, he gets back. At that time, there was a dog called Strongheart, which was big in movies. But Duncan goes out, manages to sell Rin Tin Tin as being much better at being a stunt dog. Makes 27 movies with him. The movie theaters, the movie makers, call Rin Tin Tin films mortgage lifters because they make so much money. Now, Rin Tin Tin eventually dies. By the way, along the way, Duncan, who is no fool, has been giving puppies, Rin Tin Tin puppies, to a lot of the big stars in Hollywood. After the original Rin Tin Tin dies, there's another total of about 7 that appear one place or another. Duncan himself seems to be a rather odd duck. He gets along more easily with the animals than he does with people. But his dogs do extremely well in the movies, all the way into the era of television. So this is somebody for whom a casual find on the battlefield turned out to be something very important. Now let's go to the Brits. This is William Howard Livens. Came from a reasonably well-to-do British family. He would have been called a gentleman, not quite an aristocrat, but sufficiently far up in the system to be immediately commissioned as a captain in the army, specifically in the Royal Engineers, because his education was as a civil engineer. He supposedly had a huge vendetta against Germans. Some of the sources say it's because his wife was on the Lusitania, but the record shows that he did not get married until 1916. So that's unlikely. Probably just hated Germans for general purposes. And one of the things he wants to do is kill as many of them as possible. Now he looks at how the British are using gas. And there were basically 2 ways it was delivered. What's called cloud gas. Wait till the wind is in the right direction and open up the canisters of gas and let it drift over the enemy. Very inefficient. Or from artillery shells. Very expensive, and it takes a lot of them. Comes up with a new way to do it. It's called the Livens projector. Now it's just a simple thin-walled tube with a base plate. It gets buried in the ground. You put a propelling charge in the base, and these canisters of gas go on top, and they've got a fuse on top that bursts. So what basically happens is that you fire it, this thing goes sailing out over the enemy lines, hits the ground on the other side, and opens up there. So that all the gas is on the enemy side. You can, by the way, also use flammable stuff in it. Now, they're put out literally by the thousands. They can, by the time the war is over, they're able to reach out about 3,000 yards from where they're fired. And apparently watching them fired is quite a fireworks display. Now, when you look at this picture, if you're sharp-eyed, you'll pick up 2 things. Number 1, those are American uniforms, not British. And number 2, they're more appropriate to early World War II than World War I. This is at probably in Edgewood Arsenal, which is where chemical training was. And you can see how the projectors are in the ground. That's because the Livens projector is still in the American arsenal and the British arsenal until 1942. It's never used in war in World War II, but it was there. Now, when Livens got home after the war, the British government was handing out cash awards for people who invented things that were useful. He gets 5,000 pounds for the Livens projector. That's equivalent to about £250,000 in today's money. Whatever goes on, he continues his inventing of things. 1924, he invents a home dishwasher. Looks a whole lot like modern ones, a little bit clumsier. But the tale is that he built it and had it installed in his kitchen at home. And the first time he used it, it flooded out the kitchen and it was never used again. But he did continue to improve it. Now, this is a period of time when if you asked a British gentleman, which was basically defined as somebody who didn't have to work for a living, what he did, you'd more likely be told about his hobbies than about his job. In Lieben's case, they're yachting, photography, inventing things, and spiritualism. He loved seances and went to a lot of them. He had a lot of contacts very high up in the British military too because of seances, because they were getting into it. Now he comes in 1940 rather, and he's offered a job with the Royal Air Force as an Air Commodore. That's equivalent to a 1-star. He says no, he wants to come in and work for the government, but as a civilian, so he can tell his military bosses what he really thinks without having to be worried about military courtesy. He goes to work for a little organization called the Ministry of Petroleum Warfare, which is exactly what it sounds like. How do you use fire to fight the war? And he continues to invent. And one thing he invents is called the flame fugace. Now, this is actually a diagram from an American manual, because it's the clearest one I could find. Basic idea is you take a fuel drum, fill it with something flammable, put a top on it. It's got to be basically removable, but tight. You put a propelling charge at the base of it. And we used C4 plastic explosive. The British used black powder. And then you put something inside that will ignite the fuel when you fire the propelling charge. What you get when you do that is this. Now, the British put about 50,000 of these things around southeastern England, all around the areas where they expected the possibility of a German invasion. They were camouflaged, and local Dad's Army, as it was called, local home defense people were told to find a hiding place nearby, and if the Germans arrive, fire this thing. Most of them were collected after the war, but they still find them one place or another. The fuel in every case nowadays has long since evaporated, but they're still dangerous because of the explosives that was used as propellant. This picture, by the way, is from training of U.S. Marine engineers at 29 Palms in California just a few years ago. The flame fugace is still in the arsenal as an improvised weapon. Now here's one everybody's heard of. And he has one of the most bizarre after-war lives at all, Erich Ludendorff. Now Ludendorff is sacked by the Kaiser right before the armistice. Hindenburg also offers his resignation, but it's turned down. Ludendorff really resents that, refuses to go back to headquarters in the same car with Hindenburg. He does go back, retrieves his personal things, and comes back to an apartment his wife has been renting in Berlin. And by her description, sits at a table and stares at the wall for days. Unfortunately, however, there is great unrest in Berlin. There's a group called the Spartacists, very left-wing violent revolutionaries. And there begin to be rumors that the Spartacists are going to try and grab Ludendorff. It's not clear what they want to do with him, but they're going to grab him. So eventually, his wife's landlady throws him out. He goes from being the virtual dictator of Germany to being thrown out by a landlady. Goes and lives with his brother in Potsdam for a while, not long, and is finally, it was suggested that he leave the country. Now he heads off with another officer. They get to the railroad station, and the Spartacists are all around there. And this is where the story of the false beard and the blue glasses comes in, because he puts a disguise on to get him through the Spartacus without being captured. Makes his way first to Denmark. He's in Copenhagen for a while, but he's been recognized, and things are getting unpleasant with the Danish government. He then goes to Sweden and is put up by some acquaintances in Sweden for about 6 months. He immediately sits down and begins to write his memoir of the war. And this is a very intelligent man, because over the course of that 6-month period, he writes about a 700-page long memoir of the war. Now, he obviously has people helping him because he's asking for papers and so forth from Germany, and they're being sent to him. But it's a rather remarkable accomplishment, but is also full of the themes that shows up later in his writing. The army didn't lose. We were betrayed by these left-wing politicians, so forth and so on. They're starting to have the echoes of the anti-Semitism that appears in later writings. His wife, meantime, has also been tossed out by the landlady, because there's starting to be rumors that the Spartacus are going to grab her to force Eric to come home. She goes to Sweden, spends some time there, but becomes very ill, has to come back to Germany and into the hospital. At the end of the 6-month period, the Swedish government finally decides that Ludendorff needs to leave. Now, by this time, the worst of the unrest in Berlin has died down. Ludendorff comes back, goes into a hotel suite in Berlin, and then into a house sort of on the outskirts of Berlin with Freikorps armed guards on the house. And his house becomes a meeting place for extreme conservative right-wing politicians and agitators. And in early 1920, they come up with a plot to put a man by the name of Kapp, K-A-P-P, who's a very right-wing politician, have a coup d'etat supported by the Freikorps, and put Kapp in as chancellor, with Ludendorff to command the army. So into Berlin they go. Most of the government of the Weimar government gets out of Berlin. Some of them stay. A few of them give up their offices to designated members of the putsch, the coup. But the government, the legitimate government, calls for a general strike. And within about a day, the whole thing falls apart. Kapp resigns as, quote, chancellor, unquote, gets on an airplane and flies to Sweden. And Ludendorff leaves and goes to Bavaria, because the Bavarian government had proven to be rather uncooperative with the central government. He eventually ends up in a kind of a villa there, and he's gone further and further to the right. His writings have gotten stranger. He begins to condemn Christianity because it's a religion of peace. He is a strict social Darwinist. He believes that the only government in Germany that's a good one is a military government, and an authoritarian one at that. His house again becomes a meeting place for right-wing politicians. In early 1923, he meets Hitler, introduced by Goering, who of course had been a fighter pilot in World War I. And after a few meetings with Goering, with Hitler, decides that, he likes what the man has to say, at least about being German, being Aryan. So in late 1923, we have the famous beer hall putsch, in which Ludendorff accompanies Hitler in an attempt to seize power first of the Bavarian government by force, and then supposedly going to take over the central government in Berlin. They managed to seize a few offices in Munich, and the next day they're marching down the street heading for what's called the Feldherrenhall, the main headquarters. And you know, Hindenburg, by the way, is in full uniform with decorations. And there is a line of armed police across their path. Somebody fires a shot. It's unclear who. There is an exchange of fire. A number of Nazis are killed. Goering is wounded. The Nazis just get Hitler out of there as quickly as they can. Hindenburg, on the other hand, keeps marching right straight forward, pushes his way through the lines of armed police, whereupon he is, to use the quote of one book, respectfully arrested. He is then taken to a police station where he sits for a little while. They put him in a police car and take him home, which outrages him. Now, Hitler's arrested a bit later. He and other Nazis are tried for treason against Bavaria. Ludendorff is included in the trial. He's acquitted, which he says is an insult to him and his uniform. Now, he gets further and further out into strange territory as time goes on. He's become estranged from his first wife. She was always kind of a leveling influence on him. She kept him on an even keel. But by 1925, the first thing that happens is that the previous president of Germany dies, and they have to elect a new one. Ludendorff, possibly at Hitler's request, runs for president as a Nazi and gets a whopping 1.1% of the vote. Total humiliation. There's no clear winner on the first pass. On the second pass, Hindenburg wins. But by this time, Ludendorff has come under the influence of this lady, Mathilde von Kremnitz. He divorces his first wife in 1925 and marries her. She's a German psychologist. And in modern terms, we'd call her a conspiracy theorist. She writes all sorts of criticism of Jews, Catholics, the Freemasons. Fits right in with things that Ludendorff has been saying for quite some time. And oh, by the way, he continues to press the stab in the back idea with every chance he gets. He still writes not only sort of quasi-political things, but also military things. The military things are much better all the way around. Example of some of the things they write: Ludendorff, the destruction of Freemasonry through revelation of their secrets. And she is the triumph of the immortal will, which is some kind of a really strange metaphysical idea of how the will of the Aryan people can make them immortal. Trying to read it is, don't do it. I recommend against. You want to know what they were writing? Here's some quotes. That second piece is fascinating because in one long sentence fragment, he manages to indict Freemasons, Jews, because the Jehovah year business comes from Jewish numerology, the French, and again the Masons, and the Catholic Church. And if you hear a whizzing, that is because Clausewitz is spinning in his grave over that last quote. That comes out of his last book called Totalkrieg, Total War. He firmly believed by the end of his life that the only thing that mattered was being able to win war and that was the primary purpose of the state. Now, this is the only picture of Erich Ludendorff I was able to find where he had a smile on his face and that patented scowl otherwise. This is taken at his 70th birthday party in 1935. They're in the middle of a nice little tea party. Ludendorff, his wife, his second wife, and friends, when up drives a motorcade, and out pops Hitler. Now, Ludendorff and Hitler had been estranged since 1925, when Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor in 1933. Ludendorff sent a telegram to Hindenburg that basically said, "You have just screwed Germany." It was considerably worse language than that, very, very harsh. Hitler comes whizzing into the house with a piece of paper in his hands and announces that he wants to promote Ludendorff, the field marshal. Ludendorff's rank had never been more than General der Infantry, a 3-star. I have to admit, he's a man who never went for personal profit or aggrandizement. He had at one point been offered by the Kaiser to be made a Count and von Ludendorff. He turned it down on the basis that he didn't want a name better than his father's. This time, what he does is leap to his feet, beat his fist on the table, and say, "Herr Hitler, field marshals are made on the field of battle, not at a tea party." Hitler turns and leaves. Ludendorff lives for 2 more years and continues to write. Very prolific. Some of his stuff is very good. Some of it is not. Let's go a completely different direction. Allow me to introduce you to Solomon Butler. Saul Butler was born in Oklahoma. His family moved to Hutchinson, Kansas when he was a boy. His father had been a slave and had actually picked the family name Butler in honor of Union General Benjamin Butler, because he'd served in the black troops that Butler raised in Louisiana. Now, in high school, Saul Butler becomes an outstanding athlete. And he becomes not the first African American whose athletic prowess helps him to a degree to overcome some of the racism. After a while, his high school coach moves to Rock Island, Illinois, and Saul Butler follows him. Sets national high school records in a number of sports, to include the long jump. He then is admitted to Dubuque College. It's a private Presbyterian college, and obviously quite liberal for the period, because a picture like that would be very unusual in 1914 America. He is the quarterback of the school football team all 4 years, which was the first time that had been done by an African American. But whoops, wait a minute, I said he was in college all through the war. He was. We've seen his draft card. He did register for the draft. But I spoke to a history professor at Dubuque University, as it is now, who informed me that Butler was a member of, quote, the Student Army Training Corps throughout the war. ROTC, basically, that kept him from being drafted. But here he is. He's got a discharge chevron on. He's wearing a uniform. And it's a passport picture. Why is that? Well, in 1919, the United States promotes the Inter-Allied Games. This was a mostly American idea and a mostly American financed idea. I found a book on it, and the U.S. was even feeding the other teams. But we put together what I can only call a team of, at times, ringers. Because the boat that took Solomon Butler, who'd never been in France, to Paris to compete in the games, because he's the best long jumper around. Included a whole bunch of other names that I was able to find later in the winners list of the Inter-Allied Games. We stacked the deck. Now, Butler himself is superb. He wins the long jump. He is, believe it or not, knighted by the King of Montenegro. But in what is typical of the period, the film of the actual getting his award is captioned "Dusky Saul Butler." And throughout the whole time, there are no press mentions of him that don't somehow or another bring race into it. Now they go back to the United States, 1920. Here we go again, Iowa Negro jumper. He wins the Olympic trials in the US to go back for the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp. Unfortunately, he is injured and doesn't finish at Antwerp. Comes back to the United States. Okay, what do I do now? Well, the first thing he does, he gets into the NFL. Plays for the NFL for a while. 1923, there is a meeting of the American Legion in New Orleans. And Butler goes down there representing a chapter of the American Legion named for the senior Black American officer in World War I. Gets down there and the locals won't allow him to compete in anything athletic, and they won't allow him to participate in the meetings. They're not going to allow anybody who is not Caucasian in their game. Now, what they don't know is that there are members of that same chapter who are in fact Black according to the standards of New Orleans, but who are light-skinned enough to pass, and they do compete. Now, Butler plays for a couple of years in the NFL. 1925, he plays for the Kansas City Monarchs. Goes back to the NFL, playing as quarterback for the Canton Bulldogs, along with Jim Thorpe. But he has problems even then because for one game, the New York Giants refuse to come on the field if he's going to play. So he has to retire. Now, for the rest of his life, Butler moves a lot. He spends time as a sports writer for what then were Black newspapers in Chicago. He works with children in sports programs in Chicago. He goes out to California for a while. He works as the music agent for Paul Robeson for a while. He reopens Jack Johnson, the Black heavyweight champions bar in California. Basically does whatever he can to hold body and soul together and to not be pressed down by the system. By 1954, he's working in a bar in Chicago. A drunk patron is harassing other patrons, so Butler throws him out. The man gets a gun, comes back in and starts shooting. Butler pulls a gun from under the bar and fires back. Butler dies the next day. The shooter dies immediately. Saul Butler is buried in Hutchinson. Now, Dubuque University still has a Saul Butler Leadership Award that they give out. Every year they have a Solomon Butler track meet. And that history professor I spoke about is in the process of writing a biography of Solomon Butler, and I'm waiting to get my hands on that. All right, Otto von Habsburg. Now, Otto is the child in this painting, And I believe the painting had to be done sometime between July of 1914 and November of 1916 as a Three Kaisers work with Franz Josef, Karl, now the next in line, and Otto, Karl's heir. Now the family eventually has to leave after the end of the war. They first go to Switzerland, and Karl makes a number of attempts to get back into politics. He had signed an agreement to withdraw from public life, but he never used the term abdicate. And as far as the Habsburg family was concerned, that meant he was still the legitimate Kaiser. But after the second time of trying to get back and get recrowned as King of Hungary, the Allies grab Karl and his wife Zita and put him on a warship, and they are taken out to the island of Madeira. They had left the children behind in Switzerland under the care of some friends, but they are reunited in Madeira. They are there for a few years. Karl comes down with pneumonia and dies. And one of the more curious things I found is that there is an active movement in the Catholic Church to have Karl von Habsburg made a saint because of his attempts to bring about peace in World War I. He's already been made a servant of God, and the effort continues to this day. Now, Otto is raised in the belief that he is now the Kaiser. In 1923, after Karl's death, King Alfonso XIII of Spain sends a warship to Madeira, picks the family up and brings them back, and a group of Spanish aristocrats buy them a villa on the north side of Spain, where they lived for a while. It's never been really clear to me who's providing the money for all this. It seems to be one of the characteristics of all these peripatetic royal families. Their finances really are not expressed. Now, Otto is brought up, as I said, in the belief that he's the Kaiser. His mother insists that he learn German, Hungarian, French, English, Latin, and Serbo-Croatian. He gets himself photographed in Hungarian dress and in the costume of an organization called the Austrian Tyrolean Rifles. The other members of the family are told to address him as Majestate, Your Majesty. And two of the primary ones are Franz Ferdinand's two sons, the Hohenberg boys, as they get called later. Now, he grows up continually agitating to come back. They move around a bit. He himself eventually goes to the University of Louvain in Belgium, earns a PhD in no guesses political science. The family lives in Belgium for a while. His sisters marry off and go to other places in Europe, but always, of course, to correct people. He himself marries a German princess, again, correct by the Habsburg rules. Of course, this is the time we're getting into the 1930s. Hitlerism, Nazism is rising. He is not happy with the idea of the Nazis, condemns it thoroughly. And Adolf Hitler himself hates the Habsburgs. Dates all the way back to when he was basically homeless after being denied entry to art school in Vienna. And he had to see all these glittering Habsburgs going one place or another and doing something. Also, he didn't like the fact that the Habsburg Empire was, as he called it, mongrel, too many non-Germans in it. You had to be a German to be of any account at all. Now, there is an active movement in Austria to return the Habsburgs, headed up by none other than the two Hohenberg brothers. But in 1919, the socialist government of Austria had passed something called the Habsburg Law, which deprived the Habsburgs of all their property and required any male Habsburg to sign a pledge that they would give up any rights to the throne before they could come back to Austria. Didn't matter to the Hohenbergs because they never had a claim anyway, but it was specifically designed, among other things, to keep Otto out. Now, as things go worse to worse in Austria, Otto gets more and more involved trying to help. He finally tells the last independent chancellor of Austria, a man named Stresemann, offers to take over the chancellorship if he can only come back to Austria and try and keep Austria independent. That doesn't happen. Germany moves into Austria and actually is greeted by most Austrians fairly happily, although 6 weeks before it would have been another way around. The military operation to move into Austria is actually called Operation Otto. Now, once World War II begins and the Germans attack into Belgium, by then the family has moved to Paris. Hitler, first of all, has canceled their Austrian citizenship. So the family has to get, first of all, passports from Monaco and from the Knights of Malta and eventually from Spain. But Hitler orders that if Otto is captured at any point, he's to be executed immediately. Now they leave Paris, they go to Bordeaux, where the French government has withdrawn to, as the Germans move into France. He spends a certain amount of time trying to help people get out of France, refugees get away. Then he and his family move down. They manage to cross the border into Spain, from there to Portugal, and then to the United States. Now, in the US, he's known as Otto of Austria, speaks to Congress, meets with FDR. He tries to promote the idea of something he calls the Federation of the Danube, which is going to be more like Austria-Hungary 2.0, but it never goes anywhere. End of the war, he comes back. He still can't get into Austria. Eventually lives in Germany for a while. Becomes something of an elder statesman. He is a European politician by this point. He champions European unity, really wants to put together something like the European Union. Lives in a house called Villa Austria in Bavaria. Finally, in 1956, he's given an Austrian passport that's good for every place but Austria. And eventually, in 1961, he signs a paper that the Austrian government, because the left wing in the Austrian government had always opposed his return, that gets him full Austrian citizenship again. But he's living in Bavaria. Now, the idea comes up from somebody in Germany to make him the member of European Parliament for Bavaria, but he's Austrian. So how are they going to do that? In one of those weird things that occurs, at some point in the past, he had been elected to the Académie Française. And for reasons I still don't understand, members of the Académie Française were eligible for German citizenship. So he becomes the member of the European Parliament for Bavaria for 20 years. Now, eventually retires. He's still advocating European unity. And he dies in 2011 at the age of 98. Now, if you want to see something interesting, go to YouTube and searched for Otto von Habsburg funeral. It was held in Vienna, and it was this immense long column of people dressed in various uniforms and national costumes that went on for block after block after block after block. And it ends up at the Capuchin Church in Vienna, which is where the Habsburg crypt is. And this gentleman goes up to the door, which is closed. He knocks 3 times on the door, and the abbot inside says, "Who's there?" And he proceeds to read from that large book all of Otto's imperial titles. And it goes on for a long, long time. Gets to the end, ending in etc., 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 and the abbot says, "We don't know him." Knocks 3 times again. "Who's there?" He proceeds to read all of the civil accomplishments of Dr. Otto von Habsburg, which again goes on and on and on. Get to the end, "We don't know him." Knock, knock, knock a 3rd time. "Who's there?" "Otto, a poor sinner seeking redemption. Him we know." So they take the casket in, and it's now interred in that church. What's interesting is that his heart had been removed, and it is interred in a monastery outside of Budapest, the old Austro-Hungarian custom. Hunter Liggett, my favorite World War I general on the American side. Competent, doesn't seem to be infused with too much of the problem of ego that so many of them, the others have. He's concerned for his men, and he does the best job of, I think, pretty much any American general. End of the war, he thinks he's going home fairly soon. He's asked to go take command of 3rd Army, which is the occupation force at Koblenz, which he does. Now, he looks around 3rd Army. They don't have all their artillery. They don't have their supporting forces. He knows he really doesn't have a fighting force. But as we get into the summer of 1919, nobody is sure if the Germans are going to sign the peace treaty or not. And while he's worried about being able to fight if he has to, because Marshal Foch, still the supreme Allied commander, is telling everybody, get ready to go to Berlin. Hindenburg and Wilhelm Grüner, Ludendorff's successor, are telling the German government there's no way we can put up any resistance. Fortunately, the Germans sign. Nothing else has to happen. Summer of 1919, Hunter Liggett comes home. Now, he's met as a hero. He goes out to Reading, Pennsylvania, where he's from. He's fated out there. He had asked for command of the Western Department out in San Francisco and was given to it. And he finished up his military career there for another couple of years. He reaches the mandatory retirement age of 64, retires from the Army as a major general, because with the exception of Pershing, all other officers had to give up their temporary rank in 1920 when they returned home. Pershing, of course, kept his 4 stars and turned them gold. And that doesn't get fixed until 1930, when Congress returns him and some of the other general officers to their wartime rank. So he is a lieutenant general on the retired list. Now, he lives quite quietly. He is called back to active duty one time to go represent the U.S. at a 100-year freedom celebration for Colombia in South America, and then goes off again. But typically, at one point, shortly after retiring, he hears that the local VFW is building a new clubroom for soldiers who have returned from France. Puts on a pair of blue overalls, shows up, and just starts hammering nails and sawing boards. And it's over an hour before anybody there recognizes him. And then he does this more than once. He lives a quiet life. he had written a final report on First Army activities and sent it out. But Pershing saw the report and didn't like it. He made everybody withdraw it in a, unfortunately, fairly insulting way. And it took years before the final report on World War I official actually got printed. Somebody asked him one time why he hadn't sent out a report. His only comment was, "That's Jack Pershing's job." Now, he died 1934. He's buried at the Presidio. And he is the only Army World War I general that has an active Army post named for him, Fort Hunter Liggett in California. The Marines have Camp Lejeune for John Lejeune. But we don't have a Fort Pershing. We don't have a Fort Harbord. We don't have a Fort Bullard. Like I said, he's my favorite World War I general. I admire the man. Okay, folks, this gets complicated. Now, Queen Victoria had 24 grandchildren, 20 boys and 22 girls. In 1894, Duke Ernst II of the little German state of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha dies without a male heir. That's important because Saxe-Coburg-Gotha is where Prince Albert had come from. He was actually Ernst's younger brother, but he died in 1861. Just for comparison, the red spot is Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. This is not a wildly large piece of ground. It is fairly well to do. The Duke owns 12 castles, one place or another, and has quite a bit of money. But it's still something of a postage stamp of a state. Now, because Albert was gone, his children, his sons, become the next in line. Now, number one is Edward, the Prince of Wales. He's not going to give up the throne of England for a chance to be Duke of a little bitty German dukedom. Number two son is Alfred. Now, Alfred is an actual, for real, serving admiral in the Royal Navy. I don't think he really wanted to go, but his mother was absolutely determined that Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, her beloved Albert's home, was going to stay in the family. So off Alfred goes to become the Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Now, he has a son at the time he becomes the Duke, so that's good. However, within a couple of years, the son gets involved with another one of these unsuitable women that seems to bother a lot of royal houses. He commits suicide. And Alfred, by the way, is also the father of Queen Marie of Romania, who's up on the Pantheon. Now, Alfred dies in 1900 of throat cancer, another thing that got a whole bunch of them in the days of heavy cigar smoking. The third son has nothing, wants nothing to do with it. He's an actual general in the British Army, doesn't like the Kaiser, and the Kaiser doesn't like him. So normally the choice would fall on the fourth son, Prince Leopold, youngest son. Now, Leopold, like the other members of the royal family, had inherited wealth, position, titles, and in his case, one other thing, hemophilia. His mother was a carrier. 1884, Prince Leopold is on a trip to France, falls down a set of stairs, dies of a brain hemorrhage. 4 months later, his wife gives birth to a son, Prince Charles Edward, Victoria's youngest grandson, and just as soon as his uncle Alfred dies, he becomes the next in line to the ducal throne of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. So at the age of 16, here he is dressed for Eton. He becomes the new Duke of Saxe-Coburg. He doesn't want to go. He does not speak German at this point. But again, his grandmother, in this case, it's going to stay a part of the family firm. Off he goes. Now, he is acceptable to the Kaiser because he figures at that age he can shape him as desired. And sure enough, sends him off to, he insists on a German education. He's sent off to a German Kadettsschule and then to the university at Bonn and becomes the Herzog Karl Eduard. He's also, by the way, still a Royal Highness because he remains a British prince and remains the Duke of Albany back in Britain. At the age of 18, when he reaches his majority, he is introduced to a young woman who happens to be the Kaiserin's niece, a niece of Augusta Victoria, the Kaiser's wife, and told basically, ask her to marry you. Now, as a difference to a lot of these arranged royal marriages, this one appeared to work. They seemed to get along. They had 4 children. And they stayed together throughout thick and thin. World War I comes about. Well, he's got a choice to make. But he's got a German wife, German children, and there really isn't any other direction to go. So he becomes a German officer. Now, the total military might of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was 1 infantry regiment. And he served as a staff officer entirely on the Eastern Front. He was not required to fight British troops. 1915, George V strips him of his membership in the Order of the Garter. 1919, as a result of a law in Parliament, he is stripped of all of his British titles and property. So he's no longer the Duke of Albany, he's no longer a Royal Highness or anything else. He also has to state that he gives up the rule of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. He is allowed to keep property, but he's no longer the ruling Duke. He is a very, very angry and bitter man. 1923, Adolf Hitler has a big convention almost in Coburg, the capital city. He meets Karl Edward, and they are seen to walk together on the battlements of the castle and talk to each other very closely. And Karl Edward picks up and becomes a Nazi, specifically a member of the Brown Shirts initially. He's later called Hitler's favorite royal because he can be used for so many things. He becomes the head of the German-British Friendship Association. He is given the presidency of the German Red Cross, and he is eventually given a rank equivalent to Major General in the SA first and then later in the SS. Obviously not very popular back home in Britain. He does manage to get to Britain a couple of times on official business. The last time he goes there, he happens to be in Britain at the time George V dies, and he represents Germany in the funeral procession, dressed as an SS general, because he's not allowed to wear any of his old British uniforms. At the end of World War II, he is arrested by Americans, kept in internment for a couple of years total, and eventually a denazification court convicts him of being an accomplice rather than a major criminal. Part of the problem is that one of his daughters had married the crown prince of Sweden, so his daughter was going to be the Queen of Sweden, and his grandson would eventually be the King of Sweden. And somebody thought it was politically inadvisable to do anything more like hang him, because there may have been reason to do so. The German Red Cross was guilty of about 100,000 deaths of people who were thought to be unfit. Now, he himself was almost bankrupted by the fine they imposed, lived out the rest of his life in a chauffeur's cottage on the grounds of the castle. Most of it had been confiscated. There's a very poignant, very pathetic scene when right after Queen Elizabeth's coronation, when he goes alone to a movie theater in Coburg and sees the film of her coronation. And the last thing he sees on it is his sister Alice, who he had not been able to see since George V's funeral. This is a man who was trapped by the royal system, never wanted to go where he was sent, never had too many choices. But at the same time, he did make a choice to become a Nazi. So sympathy for him is a little thin. Somebody for whom no sympathy is required, Sir John Monash, commander of the Australian Corps. Probably one of the most inventive and effective generals of World War I. He respectively commanded a brigade, a division, and a corps. He was knighted in the field by George V, the first time that had happened since 1743. War ends, his next job is to be director of repatriation. In other words, get the Australian troops back home, which he does as soon as he can based on availability of shipping. He himself gets back to Australia the day after Christmas of, 1919. And boy, is he met as a hero. He gets all kinds of awards. He is just feted all over the country. He's recalled the greatest living Australian. Stays in the Army until early 1920. He is a lieutenant general at this point, and then goes into the reserves. And then he has to have something to do in civilian life. He's an engineer by profession, and he'd started out with a couple of very serious marks against him, at least as far as Australian society was concerned. His parents were Prussian immigrants, and they were Jewish. And their anti-Semitism plays up more than once in talking about him and about him being Prussian. At one point, somebody tries to spread rumors when he was in Gallipoli that he'd been shot as a traitor because they found he was a German spy. Obviously, it didn't work. He found good work as director of the electrification project for the the Australian state of Victoria. Electricity was just being spread throughout. He's also constantly called on to advise the government. He just becomes a jack of all trades, basically. Now, he gets sick towards the end of his life. Eventually, he dies. His funeral was the largest in Australian history up to that point, with 300,000 people in it. Now, you might expect that with him gone, his influence on Australian life would go away. Startlingly not. In the first place, there's literally dozens of places named for him. There's a Monash University. There's Monash this, Monash that, all over the country. His is the face on the Australian $100 bill. And on Anzac Day in 2018, Australia opened the Sir John Monash Center at the Villiers-Bretonneux Cemetery in France, with a very nice little museum centered on the Australian participation in World War I. If you go looking for it, there's actually a VR walkthrough that you can find online. It's a very nice little museum. Then we have somebody that goes the other direction. Philippe Pétain. Marshal Pétain, by 1934, he's the senior surviving officer of the French army in World War I. Joffre and Foch both pre-die. He spends most of the time after the war involved in the very great complexities of French politics, but always trying to keep military readiness up, and is unable to do so. The resources are just not there to do it. As he gets older, he eventually kind of withdraws. He's about 80 when World War II starts. And the Germans, of course, go through much of the French army like a hot knife through butter. It's very obvious that nothing can be done. The president of France at the time, Paul Reynaud, calls on Pétain, asks him to take over the premiership and to negotiate a ceasefire with the Germans. Pétain does. The famous handshake with Hitler. He does get a ceasefire, an armistice. The Germans end up in control of about 60% of France. Pétain withdraws, along with what's left of the government, eventually ending up in the city of Vichy in southern France. He disposes of the old Third Republic. Liberté, égalité, fraternité goes away and is replaced by travail, famille, patria, which is work, family, and country. He establishes a very authoritarian, quite right-wing government. It doesn't totally cooperate with the Germans, but there's a lot of collaboration, and particularly his assistant or deputy premier, Paul Laval, is fascist to the core. Jews are exported, if you want to use that word, to the various camps, and materials are sent to Germany from France. He's getting older and older, and eventually he is replaced in practical terms by Laval and others. Towards the end of the war, after the Allied landings in southern France, the Germans take Pétain and the rest of the Vichy government. They move them to a castle in Germany. But once Germany surrenders, he is arrested there and returned to France. He is put on trial for treason. He appears wearing the uniform of a Marshal of France, an honor he was given at the end of the war. First day of the trial, he demands to be allowed to speak. They allow him to do that. He gets up and makes a statement that basically says, I deny the right of this court to try me. And a Marshal of France asks for mercy from no man, sits down and doesn't say another word in the trial. He is convicted. He is sentenced to death. But Charles de Gaulle, who's in charge at that point, immediately commutes the sentence to life imprisonment. He is imprisoned in a fortress off the coast of France in the Bay of Biscay and lives there until his death in 1951. He's buried there. His grave says nothing but Philippe Pétain, Maréchal de France. Now, I was told many years ago when I visited the cemetery at Verdun that there is a gravesite at Verdun reserved for Pétain, but that his body can't be moved there until everybody in France who was alive during World War II is gone. Now, a few years ago, there was apparently an attempt to steal his body by right-wingers, and that was foiled. But, here's a man who served France, but in entirely the wrong way at the end of his life. Of course, by the time we get to the trial, he's 84 years old. he is definitely showing signs of senility. And there's good reason to think that a lot of what was done in the latter years of Vichy, he may not have been directly responsible for, but there was no way that de Gaulle and the rest of the French, the Free French, were going to allow him to get off the hook. Now, I've had a lot of people that most of you will have heard of one way or another. Here's somebody that I strongly suspect none of you will have heard of. This is Lieutenant David Hunter Jr. From a farm family in Illinois. His draft card shows that he'd spent a couple of years at Northern Illinois University and had been a member of what his card shows as the U.S. Cadets. That means when he goes into the Army, he's automatically officer material. He's inducted at the end of August 1917, immediately goes to OCS, graduates November 1917, goes to France at the end of the year. Kind of lose track of him for a time, but he pops up in April of 1917 as an individual replacement in the 26th Division. Between April and December, he is promoted twice, he is wounded twice, and he receives the Distinguished Service Cross. I believe that photograph was taken shortly after his return home. He's a captain, and I don't know about you, but it looks a little bit more sober expression on his face. Goes back to farming. His father had been a farmer, so was he. He marries. He has 13 children. He has 50 grandchildren. And the reason I know anything about him at all is because he's my wife's grandfather. Now, the thing about him is that almost nobody in the family knows a thing about his World War I service, except what we have dug up over the recent years. He followed his father's footsteps more than just being in the Army and being a farmer. 1922, he runs for the Illinois House of Representatives, which seat his father had held for a long, long time, and he holds it for 38 years, being continually reelected. His service in the war is used every year for every time there's an election, but he never talks about it. My wife didn't actually know that he'd been in World War I until I happened to dig up some of his records. And my mother-in-law, his daughter, knew he'd been in the war and said, I think he had some kind of a medal, but that was as far as it went. And that seems to have been in many ways typical of a lot of men of that generation. You saw things that you did not want to talk about and you really didn't want to bring home. You did what you had to do and then you came back. Now, I never met the man. Died in 1971 before I met my wife. But I rather think that he did a pretty good job. And folks, that's the end of it. And that's what they did after the war. Now, I've connected you to a fire hose of information, I know. But when I got into this thing, I have literally looked at 120 different people, trying to pick ones I thought were going to be different, informative, and provide some educational content. Hope you enjoyed it.
To everybody, thank you for attending.
Okay.
We topped out at 29 participants, which is good. And I hope that all of you have learned something from all of this. I certainly have.